emerging technologies that are out there. It only bodes well for the region as a whole into the next several decades.
Well, moving on to another domestic story, check out this headline in the New York Times. Up from the ashes, a symbol that hate does not win. Some of you may recall that about 3 years ago, on election night in 2008, there was actually a terrible hate crime in Springfield, Massachusetts. A church, a black church, was burnt to the ground, and later 3 young white men in their 20s were prosecuted for this crime. Now, it really devastated the entire community, and it has taken these 3 years to actually rebuild. The new church has just opened. It's 20,000 square feet, standing on top of an old crime scene, and its sanctuaries are painted the color of the clear blue sky. It was a really long journey for this church. They got support from all over the country. There's actually a group called the National Coalition for Burned Churches that offered rotating teams of people to come as volunteers to help rebuild. And there were Catholics who came from Chicago, Methodists and Jews who came from Northern California, students who came from Harvard. I mean, from all over the country, people came to this small town because they wanted to rebuild, and they wanted to build a symbol of hope to cover up the hatred that had devastated this church and this entire community.
Isn't it amazing how something so destructive, I'm sure these 3 youths that did this had no idea that this would be the kind of response that came out of the community, and what a lesson for them to learn that, you know, you can do something destructive like this, but you can't kill spirit. And here you saw these people band together from all walks of life. It's not as if it was just Christians or the Christian community that responded. It was really across the board, because we're all equally appalled at the idea of this kind of crime occurring in today's day and age, when we have so many bigger problems with the economy, with trying to find a job. This is just has no place in our society.
Right. I mean, there were a few individuals who were so angry at the idea of having an African-American president that they took it out on this innocent community. And I think the response was so much louder. The response of rebuilding and of hope and really a positive view of our world, of an inclusive view of our world, was much, much more powerful than the kind of destruction that these 3 people caused. So it's just something that stood out for me, and a moment for us to reflect on what can change when people really do come together.
Something bright in all the negative news we read about every day.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, the United States has always been called a land of opportunity, although these days, with the job market the way it is, it's sort of tough to see where that opportunity lies. But it does if you know where to look. Here is an article from Forbes magazine that says there are jobs to be had. You just have to know where to look. And as you might suspect, a lot of these jobs are in the populated areas of the country. Along the eastern corridor, there's lots because there's so many cities there. But really, all up and down the East Coast is your chances of finding a job are actually pretty good. If you're near a city or an urban center, you're not feeling the pinch quite as much. But if you're out there in states like Nebraska or Kansas or Wyoming, these are states where the industries, the local industries, have really suffered, and they haven't really been able to come back.
Well, Aastha, I can't help but noticing that one of those red bottom-of-the-barrel states is Missouri, which is where I grew up. My parents still live there. And apparently that's where there's a lot of problems trying to find a job for many people. I have to admit that in recent years when I have gone home, it's been really sad to even just drive down some of the major streets in the suburbs around my parents' home where shops are shut down. You know, there are all these empty buildings, and it's much more apparent there than it is living here in the Washington area. No doubt about it.
That is an important distinction. I think when you're in the city or you're close to these hubs, you don't feel and you don't recognize what the rest of the country is feeling. And by those urban centers, here are the top cities with that kind of job growth. New York, is not surprising. Atlanta, Georgia, experiencing huge job growth. Houston, Texas, Los Angeles, and Dallas, all experiencing job growth.
Well, there you go. But I'm curious about what kind of jobs people are getting in some of these places.
Good question. So there's actually several sectors that are doing better than other sectors. For example, if you're a professional and you're in business services arena, you're doing pretty well at 18% growth nationally. So that's actually, you're probably doing all right. If you're in leisure and hospitality, you're growing at 17% nationally. Finance, you're growing at 10%. Where you're really seeing the trouble spots are in retail or in wholesale or in transportation and utilities. And finally, of course, manufacturing is at an all-time low in the U.S. at only 2% growth. So this is where really our segments are lopsided lopsided somewhat as far as where the jobs are distributed. Here's something else that you might be interested in knowing. Lawyers nationally will, their mean wage is about $130,000 a year, and there's over 90,000 new jobs that were created for lawyers. If you're in the legal services, if you're an IT manager, your mean wage is about $123,000, and there's over 49,000 jobs that are out there for you to find. Pharmacists, over $109,000 a year. New jobs, there's over 45,000. And finally, if you're in the medical field, if you're a dentist, for example, your mean wage is over $158,000, and there's over 18,000 jobs that you can go out and find. So there are jobs out there. You just have to have the right skills, and to some degree, you have to be located in the right place in the country to find those jobs.
Unfortunately, it's not just having the right skills or just living in the right place. I mean, all the jobs that you listed were white-collar jobs, and so you can imagine how many people don't fit into that category and why then the suffering is so great. But of course, the geography is an interesting part of this. So the combination of the type of job and where you find the job, and then of course your skills, that's the magic. When most of us think about the news sources that we turn to on a regular basis, we think about television, internet, radio, newspaper, but there's a new study out from the Pew Research Center and the Knight Foundation about good old-fashioned word of mouth. You know, there's so much research about different aspects of the media, but what about people talking to people and people they trust?
Well, the water cooler, I mean, you know this, all the best gossip and sometimes the best news you find out at the water cooler.
Well, what's interesting is that still the majority of people get their local news from local TV news. But after that, it's word of mouth. In fact, what the study has found is that a lot of times people use the talking to a trusted source, you know, someone you know, a neighbor, a friend at work, to help triangulate or vet the information that they're hearing from other sources. So in that way, it can be a very positive thing. You know, you may take in the news from listening to NPR on the radio, but then your conversations about those same topics only expand what you understand about the particular issue. So it tends to fill in the gaps that are left by the general media infrastructure.
You know, it's not as if there's not an entire industry that's devoted to word of mouth and trying to capture word of mouth. This is called social media. And in some ways, when we exchange those comments on these news stories in the paper, that's every bit as valuable as the content of the story itself, because you can see how people are reacting to a particular piece of news. And you can see what the